Danny.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
Andy's hit Power of the Sun. Power of the Sun. No! No!
Oh,
No.
there's
both of them.
No! I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay. Don't worry.
You're gone. You're gone.
I'm not okay. I'm not okay.
Forgot. Oh, it goes off.
Oh.
Now you're dead. Yeah. Oh, that is unfortunate.
Roguelike games are a really interesting bunch. They're one of the few genres left with the guts to properly punish players for their mistakes. This is a quality which apparently consistently keeps you masochists coming back to play more and more. Today, I've picked out 4 popular roguelikes which I've played to try and figure out what makes us want to push through the frustration that has almost become synonymous with the genre in order to beat, or sometimes get absolutely annihilated by, their final bosses. I'm going to start off with Enter the Gungeon, which is a roguelike game that has no shortage of unique weapons, items, characters, and enemies for the player, and this is probably the main contributor to its replayability. No run fails to take the opportunity to show off some bizarre new gun or item which is either a reference to a popular indie game, or is one of the many gun and bullet related puns that sell the game's absurd theme. I've mentioned this game on my channel before as an example of how to make a game feel nice and crunchy, and every single weapon in this game is given unique attention to make it feel exactly right to use and fit in with the rest of this game's crack-fueled arsenal. Every chest in this game is a little hit of dopamine as you pretty much always unbox some interesting new item that will have a unique impact on your run. This is an example of an element of chaos. How you shoot and kill enemies changes a lot from run to run, and sometimes even floor to floor depending on how you manage your ammo. However, good experiences in this genre are all about having a balanced mixture of order and chaos, so elements such as enemies and bosses are left with more predictable patterns to give the player a learnable skill, which is dodge rolling through anything red on the screen. Having certain elements be more random than others is really common among roguelike games. This creates a natural difficulty curve in the game. The more you play, the deeper you get into the Gungeon, but the deeper you go, the more new content you have to get used to. This cycle repeats until you finally master the whole game and clear the final boss. Enter the Gungeon also has some hidden stat systems, for example Magnificence, which limits the amount of high rarity loot that a player can get in order to make sure that the player has to actually have some skills built up if they want to beat the game. By slowly edging in new content, the player is kept just outside of that zone where they're fully comfortable with the game, but just in the zone where they're still learning and having fun improvising new strategies with the new content they're discovering. You will find that this is a bit of a theme across modern roguelike games. Designers have realized that any game built on 100% random chance where any new content can be thrown at you at any time just isn't fun, or at least any game that is meant to have some kind of rewarding challenge. Now, for a game that is a little bit less fair in this regard, look no further than the tactically brutal Space Captain Simulator FTL Faster Than Light. This game makes me want to fucking cry at times, sending ruthlessly generated enemy encounters and agonizing decisions at you every few beacons, and if you loosen your judgment for even a moment, your entire run can come crumbling around you as if you're playing Noita. Micromanagement is the name of the game.
Well, actually, the game is called FTL Faster Than Light.
You need to use pretty much every part of your ship at maximum efficiency so you can quickly eliminate threatening looking systems off of the enemy ship and survive. In terms of moment-to-moment gameplay, this game and its cousin, Into the Breach, differentiate themselves a lot from other roguelikes by cutting out a lot of the real-time action for a more thoughtful approach. The inclusion of a pause button that lets you analyze the situation and send orders while time is frozen makes the game seem like it would be simple, but it's quite easy to focus on the wrong things at the wrong time. For example, you could be focusing on repairing the damage done to you by an enemy's volley of missiles, while the last few remaining hit points of your boarding team slowly fades away. This game really has a way of making you panic, even without the tension of fast-paced action. The skills that you really need in this game are planning and resource management, but to really succeed in these, you need to first have a good grasp of the game's content. For example, one of the first things that you may do when you warp into an encounter is to take a sneak peek at the enemy's weapons. If you have experience in the game, you'll be able to quickly identify what each of these are capable of, and what that means for your ship and your strategy at a glance. The enemy having a shield-penetrating missile weapon may make you want to deploy a defense drone or quickly shoot out their weapon systems, or if they have a defense drone themselves, you might want to keep your weapons charging and fire all of your shots at once to overwhelm the system. However, being able to form these basic plans isn't enough. You need to have set up your ship properly from the start in order to make sure that you can deal with unexpected situations like these. The dangers in this game are quite chaotic, and you need to think about what you might encounter ahead of time, making it feel a lot less grindy, as every decision feels like it matters in the long run. And this is the beauty of FTL. As you progress further and further through runs, bigger spaceships with more threatening defenses appear, and you are forced to use resources that you've been given and also chosen for yourself to beat them. And if you can't, you have to run. As much as learning little mechanical tricks helps, progression in a single run is all about eliminating all of the weakest links in your chain of systems. Pouring all of your scrap into a single system is going to end up badly in a long run when you encounter an ion star and it completely knocks that out. Despite this, the game does have defined playstyles, mostly created by necessity from the use of different ships or due to pure RNG dealing you a certain hand, but what's most important is not just being able to pull it off a few times in combat, but consistently showing your understanding of your playstyle throughout a run. A single bad encounter or interaction with the text prompt can set you back a decent amount, and the Rebel flagship requires you to have accumulated enough resources without wasting them on replacing health, fuel, or crew. This game is just not forgiving at all, which is why the idea of finally taming it is so alluring. Each run is full of moments where you wish you could go back and change something that you did. Maybe you wish you saved up more scrap so you could have bought a crew teleporter in this store, or that you hadn't sent your best repairman to get unpleasantly disassembled by giant alien spiders. But next time you're going to have the formula for this game cracked and sweep every encounter with your newfound knowledge. Also, because there are no constant healing pit stops, cough cough Hades, every time you mess up and lose health, the cost to repair it comes out of your upgrade budget, meaning that runs are often slowly lost over time as you get trapped in a cycle where your ship can no longer deal with harder enemies, and then it takes more damage, and you see the cycle there. By forcing the player to always want to use their brain at least somewhat, downtime where the player is just slogging through dull, easy content below their current power level is minimized, and the player spends more time actually invested into the gameplay loop. Although FTL doesn't always completely escape this, especially for the first sector. Speaking of games which don't give the player a lot of downtime, I think it's time to look at our next game, Risk of Rain 2. This game does quite a bit differently than your typical roguelike, and in terms of run structure probably stands out the most on this list. Instead of there being a defined beginning, middle, end, Risk of Rain 2 sort of just keeps going. This isn't to say that Risk of Rain 2 doesn't have a sense of progression to its runs. This game probably has some of the most insane scaling I've ever seen in a video game, and it's not like other games where you just get a few extra effects and your numbers get a bit bigger. The game makes sure that you can feel just how much stronger its items are making you. The reason I keep coming back to this game is pretty simple. It makes you feel fucking powerful, but also terrified at the same time.
My health! My health!
More often than not, you will encounter enemies which can decimate you in just a few hits, but you can usually kill them just as fast.
Yep.
Chance of precipitation takes a very kill or be killed approach to combat. Sure, dodging and healing is super important, but if you wipe an enemy off the map, they can no longer hurt you, right? And, despite having separate stages, Risk of Rain 2's difficulty scales with time. So even in periods of downtime after you've wiped out a horde of enemies, you're still expected to move and loot quickly and efficiently, promoting mech knowledge and clever use of movement abilities, which is again, a skill the player can master that will carry over run to run and consistently make them better at the game. This results in a sort of arms race structure to runs, where you're constantly fighting to be ahead of enemies in terms of power level. This idea isn't really unique to Risk of Rain 2, but it probably feels the most obvious in this game, and perhaps FTL, due to the absurd rate at which numbers and spawn rates scale. Securing a time lead early on in the run is important, though generally the first 15 or so minutes of a run will actually be the deciding factor for how it goes, which is nice as it means when starting a new run you don't feel as if you have to wait to get to the important moments of gameplay, like in Enter the Gungeon where I'm left mindlessly grinding out rooms only to see if I'll get the master round or not from the first boss. Then, as you go on further in the run, how fast you go has less of an impact, but the game flicks a switch and ups the stakes. Now everything you've worked for can be immediately decimated, so you better not let something like this happen. The quote-unquote order factors that the player can learn are pretty much just how to dodge enemies, how to traverse the map to loot quickly, and what items sort of work best on each character and how their abilities can be maximized to not get hit by enemies. The impact of individual pieces of loot you find aren't always large, but what is important is the feeling of how they build up over time, due to the game's stacking mechanic. A single wax quail is a neat little boost to mobility, but 200 turns you into a goddamn ICBM if you so much as look at the space button. Plus, the ways items differently impact different characters, especially characters such as Rex or Railgunner, makes building items in a run more fun than just item good or item bad at times. At the end of the day, this game's replayability comes from its character variety, and how early and late game they can feel completely different. Collecting all the achievements and then unlocking even more playstyles for these characters gives the player more to learn as they play, on top of the fact that they're already trying to push further to find new biomes and enemies each run. The amazing environment design makes great use of colour along with an alien-feeling soundtrack to create stages that feel beautiful but hostile at the same time, which really fits the game's core theme of indiscriminately massacring a whole alien planet. And honestly, just the pure fact that this game has multiplayer increases its replayability tenfold. Playing as a duo with two characters that complement each other well and sharing items to optimize each other's builds is a great experience, and the tension from the action in this game can lead to hearing some really funny screams from your friends. It's always nice to play a roguelike game like Faster Than Light or Risk of Rain 2, where collecting achievements and unlocking new things are like side grades instead of upgrades, but it's about time we talk about the roguelike's identical twin, the Roguelite. Some people are quite pedantic about the term roguelike. They take the term very literally and say it can only be used to describe games which are similar to the influential 1980s game Rogue. Of course, nowadays, permadeath and randomly generated environments are the only really important parts of the definition of a roguelike to most people. So, why has this new term, roguelite, emerged? Well, really, a roguelite is just a roguelike, but with some elements of permanent progression. However, I'd still categorize games like Risk of Rain 2 and Into the Gungeon roguelikes, despite having abundant character and content unlocks. The important part is that these unlocks actually have to be flat-out upgrades, not side grades or just alternate playstyles. And the game itself has to actually somewhat revolve more around upgrading yourself run to run, which is something that games like Rogue Legacy or Hades do. I think compared to all of the games on this list so far, Hades has the least chaotic gameplay. Enemies are kept really simple, environmental hazards never really vary, there are a few different items that appear in shops. A player can very quickly pick up on every pattern and master the game much more quickly than others. Of course, Hades isn't a game designed purely around the challenge and suffering of roguelikes. It has a story to tell, and it wants to make sure that as many players as possible can experience the wonderfully written dialogue that is woven into the gameplay so naturally you might actually start calling Hades Daddy. The game includes many resources which can permanently upgrade Zagreus and the tools at his disposal, which also permanently lowers the difficulty of the game. The idea is you start playing the game at a high difficulty, and the more you play, the more it lowers. Not just due to your own skill as a player increasing, but there's also the guarantee that the next run you may have saved up enough darkness to have better boon rarities or a whole extra life. And then, when you finally reach a point where you can beat the game, Hades makes you pile on more difficulty if you want to improve yourself even further. It's a nice system which caters well to a wide audience, but, and this is a pretty important but, it can take away from the natural satisfaction that comes from beating a game like a roguelike. When you first beat the shit out of your dad, you're left wondering, did I really get better at the game, or did I just have 3 extra lives and 4 healing pit stops carry me through the game? Now, I know some people really don't care about beating a game quote-unquote properly. I mean, look at the whole argument around Elden Ring. But sometimes the masochist inside of us just needs to feel satisfied with the amount of pain endured to reach a goal, and Hades just doesn't really reach that side of roguelikes. Also, Hades can feel very repetitive. Most boons don't feel super unique apart from some of the casts and calls that kind of just damage upgrades. The enemies can also feel a bit repetitive and grindy to fight as their movesets are very simple, and the bosses and environments are always the same. This is of course a restriction of the story-bound gameplay and very high quality standards of production and art that Supergiant has been adhering to, but I found that the lack of chaos in the runs often slightly detracted from how fun and interesting the game was as a roguelike and caused me to come back to it less, even though these factors improved the game in other areas. One thing that I do appreciate about Hades, especially early on in the game, is that even a failed run feels quite impactful, as the upgrades you acquire make such a tangible difference to the length of your runs. Roguelikes can be quite difficult to get into, and demotivating when you have no idea what's going on in your first few runs, so that feeling of progression really helped me push through the game's story. While the combat can sometimes feel spammy, there are definitely tons of strategic elements to it which you sometimes don't think about consciously just because of how easy it is to get into a flow state with this game's fluid, responsive weapons. This game has an amazing production on pretty much every level in a genre that is super difficult to inject story into. So I forgive it for being a roguelite, especially if it means I get to listen to Zagreus' voice every 5 minutes.
God damn it all. Again.
So, now you want to build a good roguelike, and where do you start? Well, first of all, you really want to identify a strong core theme and adhere to it. One thing that will really help players pick up your game is giving all of its content a strong and understandable visual identity. For example, in FTL, all weapons of similar types have similar shapes and design patterns, so even if you don't know the exact weapon on an enemy ship, you can still identify what it can do. Also, FTL makes good use of changing size and complexity of sprites to help players understand the difference between the power in these weapons. This obviously shoots a lot more than this, but also takes longer to charge. Every item in your game should have a unique identity outside of its stat line and be polished to a similar standard as every other item. Never be afraid to actually put a bit of impactful random chance into your game, such as fighting different bosses each run or having some enemies spawn with modifiers. It helps keep things interesting for the player, and variance is one of the main features of a roguelike. But also, don't get too carried away. Try not to make it so that certain content will just screw over the player. Try to keep your game a bit balanced. Make sure to put some patterns in your game that the player can actually learn and form strategies around. A good example of this might be the way FTL puts a certain number of each kind of beacon in each system, or these chest loops in Enter the Gungeon which let you guess at the shape of the current floor you're on. I'm also going to mention something which I haven't really talked about yet, which is secret or exploring related content. By breaking up constant combat with looting, exploring the map for hidden rooms, or dialogue interactions, you can make your game feel a lot less repetitive, which is something you really need to be focusing on if you're designing a roguelike. Occasionally making the player make decisions about how their run goes by maybe making them choose what to buy at a store, or explore a hidden secret area to gain some bonus, gives the player a greater sense of responsibility for how their run goes and diversifies what they have to think about a bit. In my opinion, this is so important, not only for roguelikes but just for all games in general, that if you're going to take one thing away from this video, it's that mixing up gameplay styles occasionally is really good. Do whatever you can, fishing, negotiating, digging, or decorating, as long as you're not overdoing it, and this is somehow feeding back into your main gameplay loop, it's going to add so much character to your game. The last thing I want to say is, if you're going to be putting healing pit stops for the player, understand that you're essentially creating smaller roguelike runs within runs instead of having each session of your roguelike as one long challenge that the player needs to consistently overcome. As health doesn't give a benefit to a good player but it does to a bad player, it feels like a bit of a slap in the face for doing so well in the first portion of a run just to mean that you can't heal and you've basically been nerfed. Give players bonuses for playing well, not just help for playing the game. Enter the Gungeon giving you extra health if you clear a boss while taking no damage is a good example for how to motivate players to actually play well. Of course, this matters less if your roguelike is more focused on accumulating resources over the course of a run, like making cool wands in Noita. So yeah, roguelikes, pretty cool. Thanks Obama.